In September of 1973, a school board in Dayton, Ohio, voted to eliminate its home economics and shop class programs from the middle school curriculum. The decision saved the district $47,000 annually. The board called it modernization. A teacher named Margaret Elwood, who had taught home economics at that school for 19 years, wrote in her resignation letter that the board had just decided to stop teaching children how to live. She was not being dramatic, she was being precise. The skills she had spent 19 years transmitting, how to preserve food, manage a household budget, repair clothing, cook from raw ingredients, and understand the relationship between what you spend and what you keep, were not domestic arts. They were financial tools. A family that mastered them spent 30 to 40% less on housing, food, clothing, and maintenance than a family that did not. Number 17 on this list was removed from American school curricula in 47 states between 1965 and 1980, and the decade in which it disappeared from schools was precisely the decade in which American consumer debt began its 50-year climb that has not stopped since. Number 11 was declared unnecessary by educational reformers who argued that supermarkets had made it obsolete. Those reformers were correct that supermarkets existed. They were wrong about what obsolete meant. And number 1 is the skill that Margaret Elwood taught on the last day of her final semester, that no student in that room had ever been taught before, and that every one of them could have used every day of their adult lives from that morning forward. These were not quaint skills from a simpler time. They were the operating system of financial independence. Before we start, subscribe, because what you are about to learn was systematically removed from American education, not because it stopped working, but because it worked too well for the wrong people. Number 20. Reading the land and growing food from it. Before the industrialization of American food supply made it cheaper to buy vegetables than to grow them, the household kitchen garden was not a hobby. It was a financial system. A family with a productive 500-square-foot garden in 1955 reduced its annual grocery bill by $150 to $200, which in that year represented 2 to 3 months of mortgage payments for a working-class family. The knowledge required was specific and transmissible: which crops grew in which soil, when to plant and when to harvest, how to save seeds so the garden cost nothing to restart each spring, and which companion plantings reduced the need for purchased inputs. Home economics classes taught this knowledge systematically from the 1920s through the 1960s. When they stopped, the knowledge did not disappear immediately. It thinned across one generation and vanished in the next. A family that cannot grow food is permanently dependent on the price and availability of purchased food. That dependence is worth a specific dollar amount to the food industry every year. The decision to stop teaching food production in schools was not made by people who grew their own food. Number 19. Food preservation and storage. The ability to convert summer abundance into winter sustenance was the financial foundation of the American working-class household for generations before refrigeration made it optional and supermarkets made it seem unnecessary. A woman who could put up 200 jars of tomatoes, beans, corn, and fruit in August was building a pantry that would feed her family through winter at the cost of the jars and the fuel for canning, with no grocery expenditure for those categories from October through April. In 1952, the National Canning Association estimated that home canners saved an average of $180 annually in food costs, equivalent to 3 months of a factory worker's grocery budget. When processed and convenience foods became cheap enough to displace home-preserved alternatives in the 1960s and 1970s, the schools stopped teaching preservation because it appeared economically irrational. It was not irrational. It was a hedge against exactly the food price volatility that arrived in the 1970s, the 1980s, and every decade since. The families that had maintained the skill sailed through food price shocks. The families that had not paid whatever the supermarket charged. Number 18. Sewing, mending, and making clothing last. In 1955, the average American family spent 11% of its income on clothing. By 1985, improved manufacturing had reduced that figure to 6%. Today, it is approximately 3%. But the average American family also throws away 81 pounds of clothing annually and buys replacements constantly, rather than repairing what it owns. The net financial effect of cheap disposable clothing on the average household is difficult to calculate precisely because it is spread across hundreds of small purchases rather than concentrated in visible expenditures. A family that can repair, alter, and maintain clothing rather than replacing it operates with a clothing budget 40 to 60% lower than a family that cannot, because the decision unit for every worn garment shifts from replace to repair. Home economics classes taught this decision as a default. The disappearance of those classes did not make clothing more expensive. It made the replace decision automatic, which is financially identical. Number 17. Basic plumbing and home repair. The ability to replace a washer, fix a running toilet, patch drywall, replace an outlet, repair a door frame, and diagnose a leak before it became structural damage was standard in the American working-class male population through the 1960s. Shop classes taught the theory. Fathers and uncles taught the application. When shop classes disappeared and the transmission of skilled trades from father to son was interrupted by geographic mobility and the cultural shift that associated manual competence with low status, the knowledge left the household and took up residence in the service economy. A homeowner who cannot diagnose a plumbing problem calls a plumber. A homeowner who can diagnose it usually fixes it. In 2024, the average American homeowner spent $3,400 annually on home maintenance and repairs. The average homeowner of 1955 who performed his own maintenance spent approximately $400 in equivalent dollars. The difference is not inflation, it is skill. Number 16. Cooking from raw ingredients. This is not a romantic notion about home-cooked meals. It is an arithmetic observation. A pound of dried beans costs approximately $1.50 and feeds 4 people. A can of prepared beans costs $1.89 and feeds 2. A restaurant serving of bean-based food costs $12 to $18 and feeds 1. The family that cooks from raw ingredients does not operate in the same economic reality as the family that purchases prepared food, and the difference compounds across every meal of every day of every year. In 1960, American households spent 17% of their food budget on food away from home. Today, that figure exceeds 50%. The shift was not driven by preference alone. It was driven by the disappearance of cooking skill, which made purchasing prepared food the only available option for households that had never learned the alternative. Home economics classes were the primary institutional transmission point for cooking from ingredients. They are largely gone. The prepared food industry is largely not. Number 15. Understanding interest, compound debt, and the true cost of credit. In 1958, the Federal Reserve Board found that the majority of American adults could not accurately calculate the total cost of a consumer loan. By 1978, 20 years and an explosion of consumer credit later, the figure had not improved. By 1998, financial literacy researchers documented that most American adults could not explain the relationship between credit card minimum payments and total repayment cost. The knowledge of how compound interest works against a borrower over time is not complicated mathematics. It is arithmetic that takes 20 minutes to learn and that changes financial behavior permanently in anyone who learns it. Home economics classes taught this arithmetic as a standard unit. Shop classes occasionally covered it in the context of financing tools and equipment. When those classes disappeared, the arithmetic disappeared from common knowledge, and the consumer credit industry expanded into the space that the missing knowledge left open. Here is where things get interesting. The skills above were about reducing what a household spent. The ones below are about building what a household kept, the capabilities that not only cut costs, but generated income, created assets, and produced the kind of household self-sufficiency that no employer, bank, or government program could take away. This is the part that educational reformers in the 1970s called unnecessary, and that the families who retained these skills called irreplaceable. Number 14. Basic carpentry and furniture making. A working-class family in 1950 that needed a bookcase built one. A family that needed a fence installed it. A family that needed a deck added it over a weekend with 2 neighbors and a borrowed circular saw. The knowledge that made this possible was not advanced. It was the ability to measure accurately, cut straight, join securely, and finish cleanly. Shop class taught every component of this knowledge in 3 to 4 semesters to students who would spend the rest of their lives in houses that needed things built and repaired. The carpenter who can build a deck in 2026 charges $45 to $65 per hour. The homeowner who can build his own deck does not pay that rate and produces an asset of identical market value. The disappearance of carpentry from school curricula did not reduce the number of decks built. It transferred the income from building them out of homeowner households and into the service economy. Number 13. Auto mechanics and vehicle maintenance. The internal combustion engine of 1965 could be diagnosed, tuned, and repaired by any American man who had taken shop class and paid attention. The internal combustion engine of 2005 requires specialized diagnostic equipment and software that the home mechanic cannot easily access. This technological shift made home auto repair genuinely more difficult, and it is fair to say that the disappearance of auto mechanics from shop class curricula was partly driven by the increasing complexity of the technology being taught. But the skills that did not become obsolete, oil changes, brake pad replacement, tire rotation, belt inspection, battery maintenance, and fluid management, are still teachable, still valuable, and still performed by households that know them at zero labor cost versus $80 to $150 per hour at a dealership. The average American household spent $1,186 on vehicle maintenance and repair in 2023. A household with basic mechanical competence spends approximately half that. Number 12. Home accounting and household bookkeeping. The ability to maintain an accurate accounting of household income, expenses, assets, and liabilities. Not in an app, not in a spreadsheet, but in a physical ledger that required the act of writing numbers and looking at them, was taught in home economics classes as the foundation of household financial management. It was not glamorous. It was a spiral notebook with columns for income and expense categories and a monthly reconciliation that took 20 minutes and showed you exactly where you stood. The families that maintained this practice knew what they spent before they spent it and could see which categories were growing before those categories became problems. The families that did not maintain it discovered their financial position in retrospect when the credit card statement arrived or the savings account ran out. The shift from physical household accounting to digital transaction records that are reviewed infrequently or not at all is one of the most consequential financial changes of the past 50 years. The school that eliminated home economics in 1973 eliminated the primary place where the physical accounting habit was transmitted. Number 11. Fermentation, home brewing, and making shelf-stable foods from scratch. Before the FDA and state regulations made home food production a legal complexity, and before the food safety movement associated home fermentation with risk, ordinary American households produced bread, beer, wine, vinegar, yogurt, cheese, sauerkraut, pickles, and a dozen other fermented and preserved products from raw ingredients at costs that bore no relationship to their retail equivalents. A family that baked its own bread in 1955 spent approximately 12 cents per loaf in ingredient costs at a time when commercial bread sold for 18 cents. A family that produced its own yogurt spent 40% of the retail price. These were not savings that required significant time or skill once the skill was learned. They were the automatic output of household knowledge applied to routine food production. Home economics classes transmitted this knowledge systematically. Its disappearance from school curricula coincided with the rapid expansion of the commercial food industry into product categories that had previously been household produced. Number 10. Reading and understanding contracts. The generation that built and paid off their homes before 1970 read their mortgage contracts. They did not have lawyers review them because they could not afford lawyers, but they could read, and what they read they understood, because their education had included the practice of reading documents carefully and questioning anything that was unclear. The ability to read a lease, a loan agreement, a service contract, or an insurance policy, and understand what you are agreeing to, is not a legal skill. It is a literacy skill. It is the ability to read slowly, identify specific obligations, distinguish between what you must do and what the other party must do, and recognize clauses that appear to grant you something while actually taking something else. This skill was taught in home economics and civics classes through the 1960s. Its removal from curricula in the following decades did not make contracts shorter or simpler. It made the population of people signing them less equipped to understand what they were signing. Number 9. Hunting, fishing, and foraging for wild food. This is the skill on this list that has traveled furthest from the mainstream of American household practice, but it was standard among rural and small-town American households through the 1960s and carried genuine financial weight. A family that hunted its own venison, fished its own trout, and foraged its own berries, mushrooms, and greens, operated with a protein and produce budget that its urban neighbors paying retail for equivalent nutrition could not match. In 1958, the Department of Agriculture estimated that rural American households that hunted and fished reduced their annual food expenditure by $180 to $300 compared to equivalent households that purchased all protein commercially. The knowledge required was not academic. It was observational, practical, and transmitted through direct experience with people who already possessed it. When that transmission chain was interrupted, by urbanization, by the end of intergenerational proximity, by the elimination of outdoor education from school curricula, the knowledge thinned and then in many families disappeared entirely. Number 8. Negotiation and the art of not paying retail. Every generation of American household that maintained financial independence before the consumer era shared one behavioral characteristic that the consumer era systematically eroded. They negotiated the price of significant purchases rather than accepting the price that was offered. A family buying a car in 1955 expected to negotiate. A family buying furniture expected to negotiate. A family engaging a contractor expected to negotiate. The expectation that prices were movable, that a reasonable counteroffer was appropriate, and that the posted price was a starting point rather than a final answer, was a standard economic skill transmitted through household observation and practice. The retail environment of the late 20th century, with its fixed pricing, its digital transactions, and its cultural message that negotiation was awkward or inappropriate, eroded this expectation across most consumer categories. The result is a population of buyers who accept the first price offered in contexts where the first price offered is routinely negotiable. Number 7. First aid and home medical care. Before the medicalization of ordinary illness made a doctor's visit the default response to every physical symptom, American households maintained a substantial capacity for self-treatment of minor injuries and illnesses, wound cleaning and bandaging, fever management, splinting minor fractures, treating burns, rashes, and infections with available materials, knowing which symptoms required professional attention and which could be safely managed at home. This knowledge was taught in home economics classes and transmitted through households where parents had learned it from parents who had learned it during eras when professional medical care was expensive, distant, or unavailable. The commercialization of healthcare and the expansion of medical liability created cultural pressure toward professional treatment for conditions that previous generations had routinely managed at home. The result is higher healthcare expenditure and, in some cases, treatment of conditions that did not require treatment. The underlying knowledge of when to treat and when to wait is among the most financially valuable a household can possess. Number 6. Saving seeds and understanding plant reproduction. A household that saves its own seeds operates with a garden that costs nothing to replant each year beyond labor. A household that purchases seeds annually pays a price that has increased substantially faster than general inflation as seed companies have consolidated and moved toward patented varieties. The knowledge of how to select seeds from the strongest plants, store them correctly through winter, and plant them at the right time and depth was standard household knowledge in American gardening culture through the 1950s. Its disappearance from home economics curricula and from intergenerational transmission has produced a population of home gardeners who are permanently dependent on annual seed purchases, which is precisely what the seed industry requires them to be. Number 5. Small engine repair and mechanical maintenance. The rotary lawn mower, the chainsaw, the rototiller, the generator, and the outboard motor all run on small internal combustion engines that can be maintained, diagnosed, and repaired by anyone with basic mechanical knowledge and a willingness to read a manual. Shop class provided both. The generation that learned to maintain small engines in school spent almost nothing on the maintenance of equipment that the following generation took to repair shops at $75 to $125 per hour. The mechanical principles involved are not complex. The knowledge barrier is low. The financial return to acquiring the knowledge, measured over the working life of the average homeowner's equipment portfolio, is several $1,000s. Number 4. Building and maintaining community networks of mutual obligation. This is not a trade skill. It is a social skill that had financial consequences so significant that its disappearance deserves placement on any list of knowledge the loss of which cost American households money. The generation that built post-war America maintained dense networks of neighbors, relatives, and community members who exchanged labor, tools, knowledge, food, and informal credit with one another on the basis of relationship and reciprocity rather than contract and payment. These networks were the social infrastructure of economic resilience. A family embedded in them could survive a job loss, a medical crisis, or a housing emergency through community absorption of the shock rather than debt. The geographic mobility of the late 20th century, the decline of durable neighborhood relationships, and the cultural shift toward transactional rather than reciprocal social relationships eroded these networks across most American communities. No school curriculum adequately replaced what was lost, because what was lost was not knowledge. It was practice. Number 3. Understanding the difference between an asset and a liability and building accordingly. Robert Kiyosaki made this distinction famous in the 1990s in a book that sold tens of millions of copies, which tells you something important. The distinction was no longer obvious to the people who bought the book. In 1955, the distinction was obvious to Margaret Elwood's home economics students because she taught it explicitly and because their parents lived it. A car that depreciated was a liability. A house being paid off was becoming an asset. A television bought on credit was a liability. A productive garden was an asset. A skill that generated income or reduced expenditure was an asset. The ability to categorize purchases and acquisitions correctly before making them, rather than discovering their nature afterward, is among the most practically valuable financial capabilities a household can possess. Home economics classes taught it. Their disappearance left a generation making financial decisions without the vocabulary to evaluate them. Number 2, making things rather than buying them whenever the quality is equivalent. The household that can make its own bread, its own cleaning products, its own candles, its own furniture, its own clothing, its own garden inputs, and its own repairs is not a household living in the past. It is a household that has converted personal time and knowledge into financial independence from the market for those goods and services. The market price of every good and service a household can produce itself represents a tax on the household's ignorance of how to produce it. As the range of things households could produce themselves contracted through the 20th century, first through the industrialization of production, then through the elimination of the skills that would have allowed domestic production to compete, the range of things households had no choice but to purchase expanded correspondingly. The financial effect of this expansion on the average American household is not a rounding error. It is the difference between a family that saves 20% of its income and a family that cannot save at all. Number 1. The skill of knowing what you actually need. Margaret Elwood taught this on the last day of her final semester in Dayton, Ohio, in June of 1973. She called it the lesson she had been building toward for 19 years. She told her students that everything else she had taught them, the canning, the sewing, the budgeting, the cooking, the household accounting, was preparation for this one capacity. The ability to look at what the world was offering them and distinguish between what they genuinely needed and what they were being persuaded to want. She told them that this distinction was not moral, it was financial. A household that could make it consistently would always have enough. A household that could not would never have enough regardless of how much it earned, because the distance between what you have and what you want is determined not by your income, but by the clarity of your judgment about what wanting means. The schools stopped teaching home economics because someone calculated that it was cheaper not to. They were correct that it was cheaper for the school district. They were wrong about who paid the difference. Your grandparents knew the difference between what they needed and what someone wanted them to want. That knowledge cost them almost nothing. Not having it has cost us everything.